Our planet is getting warmer, and countries around the world, including Canada, are taking action against climate change. One of the key actions we are taking is to achieve net zero by 2050. This prompted a question from Mr. Jean's grade 10 class at La Polyvalente Le Carrefour High School in Gatineau. Here is the class representative, Michael, with their question.
What does net zero mean?
We've reached out to Elizabeth Bush, an expert in climate science research, to find out.
What does net zero mean? A great question. Understanding what net zero emissions means is really important. The term net refers to the final amount of something, once you account for everything that has been added to and taken away from what you started with. Let's use baking cookies for a quick example. You bake a batch of cookies, but as you're baking, you and your friends also eat some of the cookies. If you bake 20 cookies and ate 5, you have 15 cookies more than when you started, or a net increase of 15. If you baked 20 cookies and ate all 20 cookies, you would have net zero cookies. The number of cookies at the end of the day is the same as when you started. Now, when we talk about net zero emissions of a greenhouse gas, such as carbon dioxide, instead of net zero cookies, we are essentially trying to ensure that the emissions we release into the environment equal the emissions we capture from the environment, so that they cancel each other out. We do this by reducing emissions as low as possible, as close to zero as possible, and making up for the emissions we do release by removing an equivalent amount from the atmosphere. The world needs to achieve net zero emissions to stop the global warming caused by the release of greenhouse gases, and thereby prevent further harm to people and nature. Carbon dioxide, also known as CO2, is the main greenhouse gas causing global warming by trapping additional heat within the Earth's atmosphere. To stabilize global temperature and stop global warming, emissions of carbon dioxide around the world need to be reduced to net zero. Most human-caused carbon dioxide emissions are from our use of fossil fuels for energy. When we burn fuels such as coal, oil, and gas to power our engines, heat our homes, power our industries, and generate electricity, CO2 is released into the air. Once we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels as much as possible to reduce emissions of CO2 as low as possible, we need to balance out any remaining emissions by removing an equivalent amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. So how do we do that? Fortunately, we already have some ways to do this, and scientists are working to find more. Some are nature-based solutions, such as planting more trees and restoring ecosystems. Nature can help us achieve net zero because trees and other plants remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. The carbon can stay locked up in the ecosystem or in wood products for a long time. Therefore, protecting and restoring our natural environment is a very important part of getting to net zero emissions. New technologies can also remove CO2 from the air. The CO2 can then be stored underground for a very long time, or new ways of using the CO2 can be developed, such as using it to make building materials that will last a long time, such as new kinds of concrete. So, net zero emissions relies on both actions, reducing emissions as low as possible and removing CO2 from the atmosphere to balance out those emissions we still create. The science tells us that we need to reach net zero CO2 emissions globally by about the year 2050 in order to limit the warming of our planet to 1.5 degrees Celsius and the climate change this warming causes. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would avoid many of the more severe consequences of climate change, and it is what the world has agreed to aim for. In addition to reducing CO2 emissions, we also need to drastically reduce other greenhouse gases, especially methane. Just like with net zero CO2 emissions, net zero greenhouse gas emissions means lowering the emissions of all greenhouse gases as much as possible, and then compensating for any remaining emissions by removing CO2 from the atmosphere. I hope this answers your question.
So, being net zero means making sure that the amount of carbon dioxide we release into the atmosphere does not exceed the amount that is taken out, and why it is so important to become net zero by 2050. A big thanks to Michael and Mr. Jean's class for the great question. If curiosity is keeping you up at night, don't forget to ask a scientist. See you next time.